I remember Lynn Anderson telling the story. Lynn Anderson, the preacher who passed away not too long ago, great preacher, one of my favorite speakers ever. They tell the story of running into Billy Ray Cyrus at the airport just as Billy Ray Cyrus was becoming kind of famous. And so Lynn walked up to him and said, "Hi, my name is Lynn Anderson," which was really confusing because there's a country singer named Lynn Anderson. And so there was a little bit of awkwardness right there. They kind of laughed about that. And then Billy Ray Cyrus said, "So, where are you going?" And Lynn, being Lynn Anderson, said, "I'm going to heaven, man." And Billy Ray Cyrus said, "On this plane?" Lynn Anderson's big song, the singer, not the preacher's big song, was "I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden." Some of you may be old enough to remember that song. I know my girls are going to hate this illustration. They always criticize me when I use a song. "Dad, why do you have to always use old songs in your illustrations?" That's because they stopped writing good ones in the 80s. I can't help that, you know. But I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden. Along with the sunshine, there's got to be a little rain sometime. That actually was covered 85 times by different singers, including Katie Lang and Martina McBride. Kind of a big song. It's also the title of the sermon this morning. Jesus tells us, "I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden." In fact, he said following him as a disciple, it's going to get kind of hairy at times. You're going to have to make some hard choices. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father, mother, wife, and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person can't be my disciple. Of course, that is hyperbole. He's saying we can't love anything more. But he goes on and finishes that section by saying, in the same way, those of you who do not give everything up that you have cannot be my disciple. If we're going to follow Jesus, we have to put him first, which means there are going to be times when we're going to struggle. There are going to be times when there's going to be difficulty. There's going to be times we may have to make choices that are just incredibly difficult. And Jesus says, "I beg your pardon, I never promised you a rose garden." Last week, we continued our study of the book of Philippians by looking at the text in chapter 1 that's kind of the theme statement, where he prayed for the Philippians that they would have the knowledge, the love and depth of insight in order to know what really matters. The church was having some difficulties with unity, and they needed to be better at deciding which hill was really worth dying on, something that Christians today really need to understand as well. And he assured them that they're going to be better together, and that's the title that we've chosen for this series. Well, today, Paul is going to reference the difficulty that he's now going through. Remember, Philippians is one of those prison epistles that Paul wrote while in a prison, actually not knowing what his fate would be. And he's writing to several of his churches to help them. And he references in Philippians several times the chains that he now found himself in. He's going to say 4 different things this morning in the second part of chapter 1 about those chains and how he saw the difficulties and struggles and hardships that he was going through and that he knew the church was going through, even if it was only in sympathizing with him. He says 4 things. First, he says that he saw his difficulties and hardships as being for the advance of the gospel. He saw them as God using them in some way to make the gospel spread. So he says this in verses 12 and 13. What has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Okay, Paul was so gospel-focused, he says, he told the Romans, "I've always wanted to go to Rome to preach to some of you there." Well, he found himself there. He went in as a prisoner. That's not the way he envisioned ever visiting Rome. There's some scholars that believe that maybe Paul is writing instead of from Rome, from his imprisonment before he got to Rome, the 2 years that he spent in Caesarea. But he says here, makes us think it's probably from Rome, that it's been clear throughout the whole palace guard that I am in chains for the gospel. The Praetorian Guard, the elite guards that guarded Caesar. Later on, he's going to say that he sends greetings from those Christians, those believers in Caesar's household. So Paul was making inroads even among those that are holding him in custody. You see, custody works two ways. Paul was chained between Roman guards, but they're also chained to him. He's a prisoner, but they're a captive audience. And so evidently Paul is using this in powerful ways in order to spread the gospel. He's going to reference at least once the fact that the church at Philippi began this way. You recall that one of the first converts in the church at Philippi was the Philippian jailer. And so now here Paul again is making inroads among his jailers. So Paul says, the way I'm looking at this suffering is that God is using it as a way to spread the gospel. Indeed, as we're on the anvil of suffering, as we're struggling, as if we're being pounded as on the anvil, we need to remember that God uses that struggle at times for the benefit of His kingdom. Now, we can't know exactly how that is as it's happening, of course. All we can do, we can look back at times in our lives and see how God used some very hairy circumstances in order to do some good things. And there may be some things we can look back and say, you know, I'm glad I went through that. There may be some other things we look back and say, man, I hope I never go through that again. But boy, God did do some good things out of the reason. I made some really good friends. I developed some close relationships. I learned some hard lessons. The only way that we can understand that while we're going through the difficulty, however, because we don't know what God's going to do in the future with it, is to look back, standing on this mountaintop, right? What we just sang, looking back to see how far we've come. God has always been faithful. And if we recognize how faith, by the way, Perry didn't know I was going to make that point when he picked that song out. But boy, that fits so well. We couldn't have done that better if we'd have tried, right? God is faithful. And we can know as we're going through difficulty, God will be faithful again. Never tell someone, however, the platitude that we sometimes do. Because when somebody's really struggling, we just feel pressured to say something smart. And so we say something, oh, this will turn out to be good. What Job needs when Job is sitting on the ash heap is friends that just sit there quietly beside him. Once friends start giving platitudes, sometimes they'll say just the wrong thing. That's the whole book of Job, right? So people need help in struggle when they're going through difficulty. But there's no easy answers. We just have to remember that God is faithful. Secondly, he says, he's so focused on the gospel, all that matters is the gospel. Evidently, there were some people, maybe at Philippi, maybe in a broader sense, that thought Paul's imprisonment was a good opportunity. You know, everybody respects Paul, and so I want some of that respect. And so while Paul is in prison, kind of, taken off the table, as it were, they jump into, they start preaching, trying to make a name for themselves. Maybe they're jealous of Paul's popularity, and they're trying to get people to rally around them the way that they rally around Paul. And there's others that say, well, Paul can't be out there preaching. I better pick up the slack. I better fill in. And so they're out preaching. And so Paul says this, referencing the fact that others are using his imprisonment as a time to be preaching. What does it matter? The important thing is, in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice, yes, and I will continue to rejoice. The fact that some people thought, okay, now I can kick off my career preaching because Paul can't compete with me right now. He says, if they're preaching the gospel, that's all that matters. I don't care who gets the credit. Now, later on, there's going to be some folks that are preaching the wrong things, and Paul is going to fall on them like a bag of hammers. But if they're preaching the gospel, Paul doesn't care that he doesn't get the credit. It was Harry Truman that said, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you do not care about who gets the credit. Sometimes, and we've all worked with somebody like this, right? Have you ever worked with someone that they were against any idea that they didn't come up with? And so you had to kind of manipulate them into thinking that the thing that you wanted to do, the thing that you think you need, that it was their idea. Because if they thought it was their idea, they would jump in behind it with everything that they had. It's such a struggle if what you're really caring about is getting the credit. Paul says, I don't care who gets the credit if Jesus is being preached. I remember a story somebody told me about a church that was having a knockdown, drag out, one of those central issues that churches struggle with. They were redecorating the auditorium and they were deciding on a color scheme. I had a friend that resigned from a building program because of all the bickering over color schemes. Evidently, color makes a difference to some people. But there was people that wanted to change the entire color scheme of the auditorium, and which is going to involve some expense. The elder thought they should just keep the same basic colors so that they could keep all the accessories and don't have to change them out. And bickering back and forth. Finally, they put it to a vote, and the elders decided they would go with the vote, and they voted to go with the new color over the elders' objections. Well, the old story about how many elders does it take to change a light bulb? Change! That light bulb don't need to be changed. Elders basically like to keep things the way they were. When they came in the day for the work day, the Saturday morning they had set aside for the work day, that elder who had argued so strongly against not painting this different color, not only was there to help paint, he had bought all the paint and supplies in the new paint color. He was ready to get started, even though he didn't get his way and he wasn't going to get the credit. We need more folks like that in the kingdom of God that just care about the work getting done rather than who gets the credit. The third point he makes is that basically Paul is okay no matter what happens. He says this in verses 20 and 21. So now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Paul was an incredibly difficult guy to intimidate. Because no matter, you would say, okay, Paul, if you don't stop preaching this gospel thing, we're going to throw you in prison. And Paul says, this is for the furtherance of the gospel. We saw that earlier. The gospel is actually advanced by his imprisonment. Okay, Paul, if you don't quit preaching, we'll take away all your stuff. I count all things as garbage compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ. Okay, Paul, then if you don't quit preaching, we'll kill you. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. It's hard to intimidate someone like that. Now, Paul says that he's going to be delivered in the verse right before this when he says this. I know that through your prayers and God's provision, the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. Paul says, I'm going to be delivered. He doesn't know how. Either through their prayers and what's best, he'll get out of prison and be able to go back to his normal life, or he'll be killed. Either way, he'll be delivered. And he has this long thing about, I just don't know. If I'm killed, that means I get to be with the Lord. And if I'm not killed, that means I get to be with you. I don't know which one of those is great. He goes on to reason, I don't know that God's quite through with me. So I'm going to get out of here because he needs me out there. But whatever, I'm good with it. Paul was sold out for Jesus Christ. Now, most of us are struggling to get to the point where we truly could say to live is Christ and to die is gain. that we don't know which one is better, to die and be with the Lord or to go on living and serving here. But that's to the point where we need to be striving. We truly believe that Christ is all in all, that Christ is everything. And whether we live or die, we're going to be with the Lord. So what really doesn't matter? And then finally, what Paul is really struggling with is what's going to happen to his churches if he's gone. Whatever happens, he says, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then I will know that you stand firm in the one Spirit, striving together as in one for the faith of the gospel. Paul was concerned that whatever happens to him, that his churches go on to live lives in keeping with... Now understand, we're not worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are saved by the free gift of God's grace. We don't deserve the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross, and we can't earn the salvation that God gives through Jesus. We don't add to that salvation. It's not that we try as hard, and as long as we get to a certain level, then God makes up the difference. We are saved by grace through faith. But once we are saved by the grace of God, then we are called to live in a manner that is worthy of the gospel. Paul tells the Ephesians in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 1, that they are to walk. The NIV says live worthy, but they are to walk. They are to keep step with the Spirit and walk in a way that keeps up with what God wants them to be. We have a certain point. We have to live in a certain way in order to show people. He said the whole Praetorian Guard knows about my connection to Jesus. And he wants all of Philippi to know of their connection to Jesus by the way that they live their lives for him. But especially what he emphasizes is this last thing. He wants them to be in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. You see, there's going to be enough struggles. Paul is an illustration of that. There's going to be enough struggles in Christianity. There's going to be enough going. We need people to watch our backs. We don't need to be at war with one another. We need to be focused on Jesus together, striving together for the faith of the gospel. And that's what he's emphasizing once again. We are better together. And you need to remember that you need each other. Even in those times when you're feeling kind of independent and you're feeling kind of self-sufficient, you aren't and you won't be. You need one another. That's why God has placed you in a spiritual family. Now, as he ends this section, he says something amazing that we need to take to heart, that we have not just been called to believe in Christ. Here's what he says as he ends this section. It has been granted to you on behalf of Christ, not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you're going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now you hear that I still have. We are called not just to believe, but sometimes to suffer on behalf of Christ. Paul will say later on in chapter 3 that he wants to know Christ, and he wants to know his resurrection, and he even wants to know the sharing of or the fellowship of his sufferings. Part of knowing Jesus is going through difficulty in order to know him better. James tells us to count it all joy when we go through those times, because God does something in struggle. Here's what Frank Thielman in his commentary says. The God of the Bible typically works not through the channels of economic and political power that are so accessible to us, but through the weakness and suffering that the world tells us to avoid at all costs. Boy, does the church need to hear that today. In an era when we want to join in the powers of the empire to exercise power and influence politically, that God does his best work in suffering and struggle. Thielman goes on to talk about the way that the church has struggled in communist countries. And he talks particularly about Cuba and the struggles that believers in Castro's Cuba went through as you sort of try to make communism your main ideology. You've got to get rid of competing ideologies like Christianity. Well, when the Berlin Wall fell and tensions sort of eased with communists, Cuba was open enough to where now visitors could go in. And he talks about one missionary that went in that was from the Methodist Church. And as best they knew, when Cuba fell, there was only about less than 5,000 Methodists in the whole country. And when this missionary went back in after all those years under Castro's communism, there were over 50,000 just in that one faith group. Many people had grown, had come to Christ in terrible oppression. And here's what one longtime believer in Cuba said. He said this: the search for meaning is just as crucial as the search for bread. While the economy around us is falling apart, Christians are living in a state of special grace. It is not difficult for Cubans to see the difference between the people of God and those who are desperately trying to live without faith. In other words, without hope, what he said earlier. Ordinary Cubans are becoming aware of the church as a life-saving community of hope. We want to convince ourselves that Christianity is at crisis in our country, that there are forces aligned against us to stamp out Christianity. And it may very well be that the forces aligned against us to stamp out Christianity are really simply that things have gotten too easy for most of us, that we take certain freedoms and an easiness about our faith for granted, when in reality God is calling us to be so committed. Even if, one of the things I remember always being prayed as when I was a kid, and sometimes prayer language is kind of interesting, but we thank God that we had the freedom to meet, to worship you without fear of molestation from the civil authorities. And I always thought that word molestation was kind of weird. But we thanked God that we didn't have to worry about the government crashing in and interrupting our worship. Maybe we should spend more time praying that God would give us the faith to continue to serve him, even if we were molested by the federal authorities. God works through suffering at times, both the personal suffering that we go through in our own lives and even the attack on our faith that comes from the outside. And when that happens, we need to understand that we are better together. When that happens, when we go through suffering. I remember when one of our members went through a very slow, agonizing death from pancreatic cancer. And finally he died, and we had a very informal memorial service that turned into a time of praise and worship. And people rallying around the family and people openly speaking about their admiration and what this loss meant and all of that. And I remember thinking, how do people go through the loss of someone so close to them and not have a church family to rally around them, not have people to love on them during that process? We are better together. May God help us to focus on that and really believe these words that we're getting ready to sing together. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you. There is no greater thing. You're my all, you're my best, you're my joy, my righteousness. And I love you, Lord. Are we focusing on Christ, even in his sufferings, as the most important thing in our lives? Let's pray together.